Hook. Well, Jason already bought a house and got married, and you're still. This phrase haunted me at every family dinner until I learned the truth about my perfect cousin. Growing up, I always felt like I was living in someone else's shadow. Every family gathering, every phone call home, every casual conversation somehow circled back to my cousin Jason. He was only a year older than me, but according to my parents, he might as well have been living in a completely different universe of success and achievement. The comparison started when I was in college. While I was struggling through my sophomore year, working part-time at a campus bookstore and barely making ends meet, my parents would casually mention how Jason had already landed some amazing job right out of high school. They never specified exactly what he did, but the way they talked about it, you'd think he was running a Fortune 500 company. Every time I called home excited about a good grade or a small accomplishment, the conversation would somehow shift to Jason's latest achievement. It got worse after graduation. I moved back home temporarily while job hunting, which was already crushing my self-esteem. Every morning over coffee, my mom would scroll through social media and show me pictures of Jason's apparent lifestyle. Photos of him at expensive restaurants, vacations to places I'd only seen in magazines, and always with this gorgeous woman who looked like she stepped out of a fashion shoot. The house he supposedly bought was this beautiful modern place with a perfectly manicured lawn and an expensive car in the driveway. The worst part wasn't even the comparisons themselves, but how they made me question everything about my own life. I had a decent job, a small apartment that I was proud of, and I was slowly building my savings. But every achievement felt meaningless when held up against Jason's seemingly perfect existence. I started avoiding family events, making excuses about work or feeling sick. The constant feeling of inadequacy was eating away at me from the inside. My parents didn't seem to notice how their comments affected me. They'd call me lazy when I spent weekends at home instead of going out. They'd question my career choices, wondering why I wasn't making the kind of money Jason apparently made. They'd hint about when I was going to find someone to settle down with, always followed by some comment about how Jason had found his soulmate so young. It felt like nothing I did would ever be good enough. The breaking point came during my birthday dinner last year. Instead of celebrating my promotion at work, my parents spent the entire meal talking about Jason's latest vacation photos. They showed me pictures of him and his girlfriend on some tropical beach, talking about how he'd probably propose soon and how successful he was at such a young age. I sat there, trying to eat my birthday cake while feeling like a complete failure at 26 years old. I started pulling away from my family more and more. I'd screen their calls, respond to texts with short answers, and only showed up to gatherings when I absolutely had to. The anxiety I felt before family events was overwhelming. I'd spend days beforehand preparing myself for the inevitable comparisons, trying to think of ways to deflect or change the subject. It was exhausting, and I could feel myself becoming bitter and resentful. Update 1. The first crack in Jason's perfect facade appeared about 6 months ago, though I didn't realize it at the time. I was scrolling through social media late one night, procrastinating on some work project, when I came across a mutual friend's post. She'd shared a photo from a local charity event, and in the background, I could see someone who looked exactly like Jason. But something was off about the way he looked. His face seemed thinner, his eyes had this weird distant look, and he was standing in a way that seemed unsteady. I stared at that photo for probably 20 minutes, zooming in and trying to figure out what was bothering me about it. The Jason I'd been hearing about for years was supposed to be this polished, successful guy who had everything together. But the person in this photo looked rough around the edges, like someone who'd been through something difficult. I convinced myself I was just being paranoid, maybe even hoping to find some flaw in his perfect life to make myself feel better. A few weeks later, I ran into an old high school friend at the grocery store. We started catching up, and somehow the conversation turned to people we'd gone to school with. When I mentioned Jason, her expression changed completely. She got this uncomfortable look and started choosing her words very carefully. She mentioned that she'd heard he'd been having some problems lately, but she didn't want to spread gossip. The way she said it made my stomach drop, like she knew something serious but didn't want to be the one to tell me. I couldn't stop thinking about that conversation. Part of me wanted to dig deeper, to find out what she meant, but another part of me felt guilty for even wanting to know. Was I really so desperate to feel better about my own life that I was hoping my cousin was struggling? The thought made me feel sick about myself, but I couldn't shake the curiosity. Around the same time, I noticed my parents had stopped posting about Jason on social media. They used to share his photos constantly, always with captions about how proud they were of their nephew's success. But suddenly, there was silence. When I asked my mom about it during one of our weekly phone calls, she brushed it off, saying they were just trying to be less active online. But something in her voice didn't sound right. The really strange thing was that they didn't stop comparing me to him. If anything, the comparisons got more intense, but they started focusing on past achievements rather than current ones. Instead of talking about Jason's latest vacation or promotion, they'd bring up things from a year or two ago. They'd remind me about how he'd bought his house so young, or how he'd found love early, or how he'd always been so driven and ambitious. It was like they were stuck in a loop, repeating the same stories over and over. I started paying more attention to the details in these conversations. My parents had always been vague about exactly what Jason did for work, but now they seemed almost deliberately evasive. When I asked direct questions about his job or his current projects, they'd change the subject or give non-answers. They'd talk about how successful he was in general terms, but never with the specific details they used to share. The final piece of the puzzle came when I decided to drive past Jason's house one evening. I told myself I was just curious, maybe hoping to catch a glimpse of this perfect life I'd been hearing about for so long. But when I got to the address my parents had given me, I sat in my car for almost an hour, watching and waiting. The house looked exactly like it did in the photos, but something felt empty about it. The lights were on, but there was no movement, no signs of life. The expensive car was in the driveway, but it had a thin layer of dust on it, like it hadn't been driven in weeks. I drove away feeling more confused than ever. Everything looked perfect from the outside, but something was definitely wrong. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was missing a huge piece of the story and that my parents knew more than they were letting on. Update 2. The truth started unraveling 3 months before Christmas, though I wouldn't understand the full picture until much later. I was at a coffee shop downtown, trying to get some work done on a weekend, when I overheard a conversation at the table next to me. 2 women were talking about someone they knew who'd been arrested for dealing drugs. The details were vague, but something about their description sounded familiar. They mentioned someone who lived in the nice part of town, drove an expensive car, and had been fooling everyone for months about what he really did for a living. My heart started racing as I listened, trying not to be obvious about eavesdropping. They talked about how shocked everyone was when they found out, how this person had been living this double life, and nobody suspected anything. They mentioned that his family was devastated and trying to keep it quiet, which made me think about how my parents had suddenly stopped talking about Jason's current activities. I spent the next few weeks in a state of constant anxiety, wondering if I was connecting dots that weren't really there. Maybe I was so desperate to find flaws in Jason's perfect life that I was imagining connections where none existed. But I couldn't stop thinking about all the strange changes in my parents' behavior, the way they'd become evasive about details, and how their stories about Jason seemed stuck in the past. The breakthrough came when I finally worked up the courage to do some investigating on my own. I started looking up public records, checking court documents, and searching through local news archives. What I found made my blood run cold. There had been a drug bust in Jason's neighborhood about 4 months earlier. Multiple people had been arrested, and while the names weren't released to the public, the descriptions and addresses matched everything I knew about my cousin's supposed life. I dug deeper, looking through property records and rental agreements. The beautiful house that Jason supposedly owned was actually a rental property. The lease had been terminated 3 months ago for non-payment, right around the time my parents stopped posting about him on social media. The expensive car was registered under a different name, and according to the records, it had been repossessed around the same time. The most shocking discovery came when I found Jason's real social media accounts, not the curated ones my parents had been showing me. His recent posts painted a completely different picture. Photos were sporadic and often taken in locations that looked nothing like the upscale lifestyle I'd been hearing about. His appearance had changed dramatically over the past year. He looked thin, tired, and often seemed to be under the influence of something. The gorgeous girlfriend who was supposed to be his soulmate was nowhere to be seen in any recent photos. I felt sick to my stomach as I pieced together what had really been happening. Everything I'd been told about Jason's success was either outdated or completely fabricated. The house, the car, the job, the girlfriend, it was all a facade that had been crumbling for months. And somehow, my parents knew about it, but had continued to use him as a measuring stick for my own life. The worst part was realizing how this discovery made me feel. Instead of feeling vindicated or satisfied that my perfect cousin wasn't so perfect after all, I felt hollow and sad. I'd spent so much time resenting Jason and feeling inadequate compared to him, but now I realized he'd been struggling with problems I couldn't even imagine. All those years of comparisons, all that bitterness and self-doubt had been based on a lie. I started paying closer attention to my parents' behavior, looking for signs that they knew more than they were letting on. The evidence was everywhere once I knew what to look for. They'd become defensive when I asked about Jason, changing the subject quickly or giving vague answers. They'd stopped inviting him to family events, claiming he was too busy with work. They'd even stopped mentioning his girlfriend, which now made perfect sense if she'd never been a real girlfriend to begin with. The anger I felt toward my parents was unlike anything I'd experienced before. They'd spent years making me feel like a failure, comparing me to someone whose life was falling apart, and they'd known the truth for months without saying anything. Every time they'd made me feel small or inadequate, they'd been lying to my face. Every time they'd questioned my choices or my achievements, they'd been holding up a false standard that didn't even exist. Final update. Christmas morning arrived with a tension I could feel in the air before I even walked through my parents' front door. I'd been dreading this gathering for weeks, knowing that Jason would be there, and that I'd finally see the truth with my own eyes. Part of me hoped that maybe I'd been wrong, that maybe the evidence I'd found was somehow mistaken or incomplete. But the moment I saw him, I knew everything I'd discovered was real. Jason looked nothing like the successful, put-together person my parents had been describing for years. He was thin to the point of looking gaunt. His skin had a grayish tint that made him look sick, and his eyes had this glassy, unfocused quality that made it clear he was under the influence of something. His clothes were expensive but wrinkled and ill-fitting, like he'd lost weight since buying them. He moved with the jerky, unpredictable movements of someone who wasn't entirely present in the moment. But the biggest shock was the woman he brought with him. She was beautiful, exactly like the photos my parents had shown me, but something about her demeanor was completely wrong. She seemed bored and detached, checking her phone constantly and looking around the room like she was calculating how much longer she'd have to stay. She barely spoke to anyone, and when she did, her responses were short and professional. She didn't interact with Jason the way a girlfriend or wife would, and she certainly didn't seem comfortable in a family setting. The whole situation became clear about an hour into the gathering. Jason excused himself to use the bathroom, and the woman immediately pulled out her phone and started texting someone. I happened to be in the kitchen getting drinks when I overheard her taking a call. She was talking to someone about rates and scheduling, discussing how much longer she needed to stay and when she could leave for her next appointment. The conversation was brief, but it was enough to confirm what I'd already suspected. My parents were acting strange throughout the entire day, clearly uncomfortable but trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy. They kept steering conversations away from Jason's current life, focusing instead on childhood memories or old achievements. When relatives asked about his work or his relationship, my parents would give vague answers or quickly change the subject. The whole thing felt like a performance that everyone was pretending to believe. The breaking point came during dinner. Jason was clearly struggling to stay coherent, slurring his words and losing track of conversations. The woman he brought kept checking her watch and looking increasingly impatient. One of my aunts made an innocent comment about how nice it was to see Jason doing so well, and the expression on my parents' faces was pure panic. They started talking over each other, trying to redirect the conversation, but it was too late. Jason tried to respond to my aunt's comment, but his words came out jumbled and confused. He started talking about deals and money, but nothing he was saying made sense in the context of legitimate work. The woman beside him looked mortified, clearly realizing that maintaining the charade was becoming impossible. She whispered something to Jason, and he nodded, looking relieved that he had an excuse to leave. They left before dessert, claiming they had another family commitment to attend. But I could see the relief on my parents' faces as they walked out the door. The tension in the room lifted immediately, and suddenly everyone was talking normally again. It was like we'd all been holding our breath for hours, waiting for something terrible to happen. After the other relatives left, I confronted my parents directly. I told them I knew about Jason's arrests, about the house being a rental, about the woman being paid to be there. I expected them to deny it or act surprised, but instead, they just looked defeated. My mother started crying, and my father sat down heavily in his chair, looking older than I'd ever seen him. The truth came pouring out in a flood of guilt and regret. They'd known about Jason's drug problems for over a year. They'd known about the arrests, the evictions, the lies about his job and his relationship. They'd even known that the woman he brought to family events was someone he paid to maintain his image. But they'd been so invested in the story of his success, so proud of having a nephew who seemed to have it all figured out, that they couldn't bring themselves to admit they'd been wrong. My mother explained that they continued comparing me to Jason because they didn't know how to take it back. They'd spent so many years holding him up as the perfect example that admitting he was struggling would mean admitting they'd been wrong about everything. They'd been hoping he'd get his life together, that somehow the fairy tale would become real again, and they wouldn't have to face the truth about what they'd done to me. The apology that followed was heartfelt but devastating. My parents acknowledged that they'd spent years making me feel inadequate based on a lie. They admitted that they'd known Jason was in trouble but had continued to use him as a weapon against my self-esteem because they were too proud to admit their mistake. They recognized that their actions had damaged our relationship and that they'd caused me years of unnecessary pain and self-doubt. But as grateful as I was for their honesty, I couldn't just forgive and forget. The damage had been done, and it would take time to rebuild the trust between us. I'd spent so many years questioning my own worth, comparing myself to a standard that didn't exist, feeling like a failure because I couldn't measure up to someone whose life was actually falling apart. The psychological impact of those comparisons had shaped how I saw myself and my achievements for years. The strangest part was how I felt about Jason himself. Instead of feeling victorious or vindicated, I felt genuinely sad for him. He was clearly struggling with serious problems, and instead of getting help, he'd been enabled by family members who were more concerned with maintaining appearances than addressing his issues. The pressure to live up to the perfect image everyone had created for him had probably made his problems worse, not better. In the weeks following Christmas, I started the process of rebuilding my relationship with my parents. It wasn't easy, and there were many difficult conversations about boundaries and expectations. But for the first time in years, I felt like I could be honest with them about my own life without worrying about how it would compare to some impossible standard. I started sharing my actual achievements and struggles, and they began to see me as I really was rather than as a disappointment compared to someone else. The experience taught me that the perfect lives we see others living are often illusions, and that comparing ourselves to others is usually based on incomplete information. Jason's story was an extreme example, but it made me realize how much energy I'd wasted feeling inadequate instead of focusing on building a life that made me happy. I'd let my parents' comparisons define my self-worth for far too long, and it was time to start measuring my success by my own standards rather than anyone else's.